Good evening. Police are continuing to examine a cafe in Gloucester which has been linked to the disappearance of 15-year-old Mary Bastholm, who's suspected to have been murdered by the serial killer Fred West in 1968.
The Clean Plate cafe in Southgate Street was brought to the attention of police by a television production company who were making a documentary. Mary was working at the cafe before she disappeared more than 50 years ago, and the building has previously been searched for evidence.
Well, our reporter Victoria Davies is live on Southgate Street for us this evening. So, Victoria, have there been any more developments there today?
Well, as you can see, the white tent remains outside the front of the cafe. There's a second one at the rear of the building, and police have been coming and going all day as they continuing their investigations. Now, this cafe has always been of police interest. It is where Mary Bastholm used to work as a waitress at around the same time that Fred West did some building work here. But for many people here in Gloucester, seeing that white tent, hearing Fred West's name again is a chilling reminder of the crimes he committed, as Karen Bell reports.
Could it be that cafe customers have been eating and drinking above the body of a murder victim? It's a shocking possibility, but perhaps not a surprising one. Police have long had suspicions about this cafe. Leo Goatley was Rose West's solicitor in the 1990s and witnessed the investigation firsthand.
That cafe was on the police radar when they initially made their investigation into the serial killings back in 94-95, and there was some excavation done there, but obviously at that time they didn't pick up any thread that would have prompted them to pull the place apart.
Now, quarter of a century later, an ITV film crew with ground-penetrating radar has picked up a thread. The sight of the police tent has brought back painful memories for those who knew the Wests. People like Dennis, a workmate of Fred.
Several times the police had come into the factory and take him away. And he'd come back and he'd say, "Oh, they got nothing on me." He said, "It's nothing." He said, "They just wanted to know somewhat. They can't prove nothing, so they let me go." And then one night I was having me tea and my wife said, "You better come and watch the tally. Your mate's on the tally." And that's when it all came to light. I felt really, really terrible because I knew him, I knew his kids, I knew his wife.
Officially, the Wests killed 12 women and girls, but police believe there could be as many as 30 victims. Many of the women had been lodgers of the Wests at 25 Cromwell Street, the house where they were killed and buried. Jane Hamer was a lodger there too and thought her landlord seemed pleasant.
Not in a month of Sundays would I have expected anything like that to be going on. Fred was a gentleman. Rose was just a mother that was scornful at times, but then all mothers can be like that.
Only years later did Jane realise how lucky she'd been to escape, how it could so easily have been her, buried under a building.
And my thoughts go out to whoever it is, if they find anybody. It goes out to their families, and I'll always wonder for the rest of my life, if I knew anything else, could I have helped?
Fred West and 25 Cromwell Street have long gone, but memories live on, and for many people in Gloucester, this tent is a reminder that the nightmare of the Wests will never fully end. Karen Bell, ITV News.
Well, many people here in Gloucester have long suspected there may well be more victims, but police say they won't make a decision as to whether to excavate this building until next week. At the moment, it is just exploratory works, but if they do decide to excavate, that's likely to be a lengthy process, and they could be here for many weeks. But they say they are committed to finding out what dark secrets may lie within this cafe.
Victoria Davies live in Gloucester. Thank you. Well, as we have been hearing, the current police search at that cafe on Southgate Street is focused on finding any evidence relating to the disappearance of Mary Bastholm in 1968.
It's an unsolved case that has attracted a lot of media coverage over the last 50 years. Robert Murphy has been looking back through the archives.
Mary Bastholm was the 15-year-old girl who left home to catch a bus and was never seen again. Her parents were still distraught 2 years later.
Well, she came home about 6:30 and had her tea and sat in this corner where I'm sitting and enjoyed the Bernie Winter show. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 and 7:15 with a carrier bag with a Monopoly set in. And she went out about between 10 to catch the 25 past or about that time bus.
Mary walked from her home through the streets of her Gloucester suburb. She was catching a bus to see her boyfriend.
Mary Bastholm never reached the village of Hardwick, and the last that was seen of her was at this bus stop on the main A38 road.
And her boyfriend waited.
When did you first suspect that something was wrong?
Well, as soon as I found that she wasn't on the 8:30 bus. So I went back home and then asked my sister if she'd run me up to Mrs. Bastholm's.
But what do you think could have happened?
Well, personally, myself, I think she took a lift from someone she knew. This could have been someone that perhaps came into the cafe.
Yes, the pop-in cafe. Today it's called the Clean Plate. She worked there. Back then, her colleagues were stunned.
Where do you think Mary Bastholm could be now?
Well, I think that's difficult to say. Can't imagine that she ran away, but what can you say?
The countryside was scoured. Police divers were drafted in. 2 years on, detectives were still desperate for clues.
We know that she arrived at the bus stop, but from then on, we have no trace of her whatsoever.
There was a regular customer at the cafe, Fred West. He was already a killer. He'd murdered his girlfriend, Anne McFall. He was yet to meet his future wife, Rosemary, a teenager he would first see standing at a bus stop. When their double life of murder was discovered, there were attempts to find Mary Bastholm. The cafe owner looked in the cellar, finding a rebuilt wall. A diary was found in the cavity behind. The date, 1968. Was it Mary's? Written down a man's name, Fred. At the time, Gloucestershire police said they hadn't enough evidence to justify digging up the cafe. Back in 1970, 2 years after her disappearance, Mary's boyfriend was still being positive.
Are you still hopeful that Mary will turn up?
Oh yes, I still am. Well, when I don't still know, I just hope.
That was 50 years ago. It is easy to assume, and perhaps it will be proved, that Mary Bastholm was the girl who walked out one night to catch a bus and came face to face with Britain's most notorious killer. Robert Murphy, ITV News.
Well, Gloucestershire Police have issued a statement tonight. It says, at the time of the original Fred West investigation and in response to the 2012 online petition, it was deemed there was insufficient evidence that Mary Bastholm was buried at the location. The reasons behind the 2012 decision were documented in an open letter from former Chief Constable Tony Melville. He also stated that if any fresh evidence came to light, Gloucestershire Constabulary would welcome the opportunity of reviewing it and taking appropriate action. Potential new evidence has come to light recently, and we are currently carrying out extensive inquiries as a result.